On the morning of September 19, 1944, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter stood in the commander's cupola of his Panther tank, scanning the fog-shrouded Bocage country of eastern France with growing unease. The 26-year-old veteran had survived 2 years on the Eastern Front, faced Soviet T-34s at Kursk, and earned his Iron Cross in the hell of countless engagements. Nothing in that crucible of fire had prepared him for what the Americans were unleashing in the West, a machine so fast, so lethal, that his fellow Panzer commanders whispered about it in the same fearful tones once reserved for discussing Katyusha rockets. They called it the Hellcat. Richter's crew had first heard the rumors 3 weeks earlier near Nancy. A company of Panthers, 12 tanks representing Germany's finest armored engineering, had been conducting a tactical withdrawal when they encountered American tank destroyers. Within 17 minutes, 8 Panthers were burning wrecks. The survivors reported something impossible: enemy vehicles appearing from nowhere, firing, then vanishing before return fire could be coordinated. One traumatized gunner claimed he'd gotten a solid hit on an American tank destroyer, only to watch it accelerate away at speeds that seemed to defy the laws of physics and warfare. The intelligence officers initially dismissed these reports as combat fatigue or exaggeration. Then the pattern repeated at Aracourt, at Luneville, at every engagement where American armored forces clashed with German panzers. According to after-action reports compiled by the Wehrmacht High Command, German tank crews were reporting enemy contact times averaging between 2 and 4 minutes before the American vehicles disappeared. The mathematics were devastating. In those brief windows, the Americans were achieving kill ratios that turned conventional armored doctrine inside out. The M18 Hellcat, as Allied intelligence documents later confirmed, represented a radical departure from traditional tank destroyer philosophy, where German Jagdpanzers and American Shermans prioritized armor protection. The Hellcat's designers at Buick, yes, the automobile manufacturer had been contracted to build it, chose a different path. They stripped away everything that wasn't essential to a single mission: kill enemy tanks and survive through speed, not steel. The result was a vehicle that weighed only 17 tons, mounted a 76mm gun capable of penetrating 4 inches of armor at 1,000 yards, and possessed a 9-cylinder radial engine that pushed it to 55 miles per hour on roads. Richter studied the American technical manual his intelligence section had captured from a destroyed Hellcat near Metz, as referenced in the U.S. Army's official records from the European Theater of Operations. The manual's specifications read like fiction: maximum road speed of 55 miles per hour. Cross-country speed of 35, a power-to-weight ratio that made it the fastest tracked armored vehicle in the war. His Panther, magnificent as it was with its sloped armor and fearsome 75mm gun, could manage 25 miles per hour on roads under ideal conditions. In the reality of war-torn France, with its cratered roads and muddy fields, 15 was more realistic. The tactical implications were profound and terrifying. Richter's Panther needed approximately 45 seconds to acquire a target, calculate range, and fire. Reloading took another 15 seconds. If an M18 appeared at effective combat range, call it 1,000 meters, and his crew performed flawlessly, they might get off 2, perhaps 3 rounds. But the Hellcat's speed meant it could traverse that killing ground in under 90 seconds, fire its gun with the new American hydraulic traverse system that rotated the turret a complete 360 degrees in just 20 seconds, and be gone before the third German shot even left the barrel. 3 minutes. That was all the time German tank crews had. The story of the Hellcat began not on the battlefields of Europe, but in the panicked corridors of American military planning during 1941. Major General Andrew Bruce, newly appointed commander of the Tank Destroyer Center at Camp Hood, Texas, had studied the German blitzkrieg tactics that devastated Poland and France. He reached a controversial conclusion. The answer to massed panzer attacks wasn't more tanks or thicker armor. It was speed, firepower, and tactical mobility concentrated in specialized tank destroyer battalions. Bruce's philosophy, detailed in the Tank Destroyer Tactical and Firing Center's doctrinal publications from that period, contradicted conventional wisdom. Where British and Soviet planners were building heavier, more armored vehicles, Bruce wanted something that could respond to enemy armor breakthroughs with devastating swiftness. His vision called for lightly armored, highly mobile platforms that would operate like naval destroyers, hence the name, racing to intercept and destroy enemy armor concentrations before they could exploit breaches in American lines. The development contract went to Buick Motor Division, part of General Motors' massive wartime industrial conversion. The project's chief engineer, a former racing car designer named J. Edward Campbell, approached the assignment with automotive rather than traditional military thinking. Where tank designers typically started with armor requirements and added mobility as an afterthought, Campbell began with the chassis of a modified M24 Chaffee light tank, stripped it down to save weight, and then asked his team a revolutionary question: how fast can we make it go? The answer emerged from the Detroit Arsenal in July 1943. The T-70 prototype, which would become the M18, weighed 17 tons compared to the Sherman's 30 tons, or the Panther's 45. Its Continental R975 engine, originally designed for aircraft, generated 400 horsepower. When test drivers first pushed it to full throttle at Aberdeen Proving Ground, the vehicle hit speeds that made observers think the speedometers were malfunctioning. According to U.S. Army Ordnance Department records from that period, engineers initially worried the suspension couldn't handle the stress, but Campbell's racing-influenced design incorporated innovations borrowed from Indianapolis race cars. Buick began full production in January 1944 at its Flint, Michigan facility. The assembly line, converted from manufacturing automobiles, produced the first combat-ready Hellcats in March. By the time of the Normandy invasion on June 6, 1944, the first M18-equipped tank destroyer battalions were arriving in England. The European theater of operations would eventually receive more than 2,400 Hellcats, organized into battalions that operated with an independence unusual in the rigidly hierarchical American Army structure. The crews selected for Hellcat battalions underwent specialized training that emphasized aggression and initiative. Unlike conventional tank units that operated in coordinated formations with infantry support, tank destroyer doctrine called for commanders to identify enemy armor concentrations, race to advantageous positions, engage from ambush, and withdraw before enemy forces could coordinate effective counterfire. The official motto of the tank destroyer force, seek, strike, and destroy, wasn't mere propaganda. It was operational doctrine distilled to 3 words. Lieutenant Marcus Webb of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion experienced his first combat engagement in the Hellcat on August 12, 1944, during the American breakout from Normandy. His battalion had been positioned near Argentan when German forces launched a counterattack with elements of the 2nd Panzer Division. Webb's platoon, 5 Hellcats operating as an independent unit, intercepted a column of 8 Panzerfeuerers attempting to reinforce the German defensive line. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. Webb's after-action report, preserved in the National Archives World War II records collection, describes a running battle where his platoon used speed and maneuverability to dictate every term of the engagement. His Hellcat crew would race to firing positions on the flanks of the German column, fire 3 or 4 rounds, then accelerate away before the Panthers could bring their heavier guns to bear. When German tanks attempted to wheel around to face the threat, other Hellcats would appear from different angles, turning the engagement into a 3-dimensional chess match played at 50 miles per hour. All 8 German tanks were destroyed. Webb's battalion suffered 1 Hellcat disabled by a thrown track, not enemy fire, and 2 crew members wounded by shell fragments. Sergeant Thomas Red Morrison climbed into his M18's turret on a cold October morning, 1944, outside the French town of Bruyères, running through the familiar pre-combat ritual that separated professional tank destroyers from mere operators. The Hellcat demanded different skills than conventional tanks, different instincts, and Morrison, a former stock car mechanic from Georgia, possessed exactly the blend of mechanical intuition and aggressive confidence the vehicle required. The crew compartment was cramped, open-topped, and protected by armor that wouldn't stop anything larger than rifle-caliber rounds. The design philosophy was brutally simple. If enemy shells were hitting you, you'd already made a fatal tactical error. The Hellcat's survival depended on being somewhere else when return fire arrived. That open turret, which seemed like a vulnerability, actually provided crucial advantages. It reduced weight, improved crew situational awareness, and allowed for faster ammunition handling. In the close-quarters combat of European forests and villages, Hearing approaching enemy armor before you saw it could mean the difference between ambusher and victim. Morrison's crew consisted of 5 men, each cross-trained on multiple positions. The driver, Corporal James Kowalski, could coax the Continental engine through terrain that would bog down heavier vehicles. His understanding of the Hellcat's torsion bar suspension system bordered on supernatural. He claimed he could feel the vehicle telling him where the solid ground was. The assistant driver, Private Danny Chen, operated the bow machine gun, but spent most engagements scanning for threats and plotting escape routes. His job was thinking 3 moves ahead. In the turret, the gunner and loader worked in the synchronized rhythm that determined whether the crew lived or died. Corporal Marcus Washington, the gunner, had attended artillery school before volunteering for tank destroyers. He understood ballistics intuitively, calculating range, wind, and target movement in the seconds available. His partner, Private First Class Antonio Rodriguez, could load the 76mm gun in under 10 seconds, even when the vehicle was racing across broken ground at 30 miles per hour. The 76mm M18 gun represented American industrial innovation at its finest. According to technical specifications documented in the U.S. Army's Field Manual 3-40, Tank Destroyer, M18, the weapon fired armor-piercing rounds at 2,800 feet per second. At 1,000 yards, roughly 900 meters, it could penetrate 4 inches of vertical armor plate. That was sufficient to defeat the frontal armor of German Panzerviehs and the side armor of Panthers and Tigers. The hydraulic turret traverse system, borrowed from naval gun mounts, allowed the crew to rotate the entire turret 360 degrees in 20 seconds, compared to over a minute for hand-cranked systems in earlier American tank destroyers. But the real innovation was how Hellcat crews employed the weapon system. Traditional tank doctrine emphasized frontal engagements where armor thickness and gun penetration determined victory. Hellcat doctrine rejected this paradigm entirely. Morrison and his fellow commanders were trained to use speed and maneuver to achieve flank or rear shots where even the heaviest German armor was vulnerable. The Hellcat wasn't designed to slug it out toe-to-toe with Panthers. It was designed to appear on their flanks, kill them, and vanish before their companions could respond. The tactical doctrine, developed through months of training and refined in combat, followed a consistent pattern. Reconnaissance elements would locate enemy armor. Hellcat platoons, typically 5 vehicles operating together, would use their speed to race ahead of the enemy advance or circle behind enemy positions. They'd establish ambush positions with carefully planned withdrawal routes. When German armor appeared, the Hellcats would engage from the flank or rear at ranges between 800 and 1,200 meters, close enough for guaranteed penetration, far enough to provide escape time. The critical moment came after firing. While German crews were still identifying the threat direction, Hellcat drivers would already be accelerating away, using terrain features and pre-planned routes to break visual contact. By the time German tanks rotated their turrets and prepared to return fire, the Hellcat would be 300 meters away and accelerating. 60 seconds later, it would be behind the next hill or tree line, repositioning for another attack from a different angle. Morrison had refined this ballet of violence through 15 separate engagements. His crew operated with the precision of an Indianapolis pit crew. They'd proven that speed wasn't just about the engine. It was about how fast you could identify targets, fire accurately, and execute tactical withdrawal. His personal record was 7 seconds from target acquisition to first round fired. In Hellcat doctrine, that was an eternity. Some crews were achieving 5-second engagement times. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber sat in the basement of a requisitioned farmhouse near Metz, studying after-action reports that painted an increasingly grim picture of German armored operations in the West. As the intelligence officer for the 11th Panzer Division, Weber's job was finding patterns in combat data and developing countermeasures. The pattern emerging from these reports defied every principle of armored warfare he'd learned at the Panzer training grounds in Munster. The numbers told a story that German high command didn't want to acknowledge. In September 1944 alone, German panzer forces in France had lost over 300 tanks across all types. American M18 Hellcat battalions, numbering fewer than 200 vehicles in the sector, were credited with approximately 130 confirmed kills. The kill-to-loss ratio was approaching 8-to-1 in the Hellcat's favor. For an army that had built its reputation on armored superiority, these figures represented something more disturbing than simple tactical defeats. They suggested that fundamental assumptions about armored warfare were being invalidated by American innovation. Weber's analysis, portions of which survive in Wehrmacht records captured by the U.S. Army at the war's end, identified the core problem. German panzer doctrine had evolved on the Eastern Front, where engagements occurred at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters across open steppe terrain. At those distances, armor thickness and gun penetration power dominated the equation. The Panther's 75mm gun could penetrate Soviet T-34 armor at 2,000 meters. The Tiger's 88mm gun was lethal at ranges approaching 3,000 meters. These vehicles were designed to fight and win engagements where they could be seen from a kilometer away. The terrain of Western Europe, the bocage country of Normandy, the forests of the Vosges, the narrow urban streets of countless French and German towns, reduced engagement ranges to 300 meters or less. At these distances, the Hellcat's lighter armor became irrelevant, while its speed and maneuverability became overwhelming advantages. A Panther that needed 45 seconds to acquire and engage a target simply couldn't compete with a Hellcat that could fire accurately in 7 seconds and be gone in 30, and the mathematics were brutally simple. In a typical engagement scenario analyzed by Weber, a Hellcat platoon would establish an ambush position along an expected German approach route. When German tanks appeared, the first indication of enemy presence would be armor-piercing rounds already impacting their vehicles. German tank commanders needed approximately 15 seconds to identify the threat direction, communicate with their crew, and prepare to return fire. The Panther's turret rotation speed, 15 degrees per second with the hand-crank traverse system, meant another 6 to 8 seconds to bring the gun on target. During those 23 seconds, the Hellcat would fire twice, potentially 3 times if the loader was exceptionally fast. Then, before German gunners could even get a ranging shot off, the American vehicle would be accelerating away. At maximum acceleration, the Hellcat could achieve 30 miles per hour in approximately 12 seconds. By the time German tank commanders had coordinated their response, identified aiming points, and fired their first shot, the Hellcat would be 200 meters from its firing position and partially concealed by terrain or vegetation. The German response time from first contact to effective return fire averaged between 120 and 180 seconds, 2 to 3 minutes. The Hellcat's exposure time in the kill zone was typically 35 to 50 seconds. The window of vulnerability where German forces could achieve effective return fire was essentially non-existent. Weber proposed several countermeasures in his reports: wider spacing between vehicles to prevent multiple kills in a single ambush, pre-positioned security elements to scout routes before main forces committed, coordination with infantry to flush out suspected ambush positions, more aggressive use of indirect fire, mortars and artillery to saturate suspected Hellcat positions. Every countermeasure had been tried. None were particularly effective. The morning of October 24, 1944, brought freezing rain to the Vosges Mountains, where Lieutenant Marcus Webb's platoon of Hellcats from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had dug in along a ridgeline overlooking the approach to St. Die. The weather was miserable, visibility was poor, and that made it perfect hunting conditions. German armor trying to navigate the mountain passes would be channeled into predictable routes, their usual advantages in armor and gun range negated by the terrain and weather. Webb had positioned his 5 Hellcats in carefully prepared positions that exploited every feature of the ridgeline. Each vehicle had a primary firing position with clear sightlines to the valley road below, plus 2 alternate positions connected by routes that his drivers had memorized in darkness. The positions were far enough apart that German artillery couldn't suppress multiple vehicles simultaneously, but close enough for the platoon to concentrate fire on any target. Escape routes led over the ridgeline's reverse slope, where the Hellcats could break contact and reposition before German observers could coordinate effective counterfire. Radio intercepts suggested a German armored column would attempt to reinforce positions further north. The division intelligence officer estimated a company-sized force, probably 12 to 15 tanks, likely a mix of Panthers and Panzer V's. Webb's platoon wouldn't engage the entire column. They'd wait for the lead elements to enter the valley, destroy the first 2 or 3 vehicles to block the road, then focus on the rear of the column to prevent withdrawal. The Germans would be trapped in the valley, unable to advance or retreat, while Webb's Hellcats systematically destroyed them from positions the enemy couldn't effectively engage. The German column appeared at 0740 hours, right on schedule. Webb counted 17 vehicles, 4 Panthers in the lead, followed by a mixed formation of Panzer IV and what looked like a couple of Jagdpanzer IVs bringing up the rear. They were moving cautiously, which was smart, but caution didn't help much when you were channeled into a valley with poor maneuver room and enemies on the high ground. Webb waited until the lead Panther was directly below his position, perhaps 600 meters away. At that range, the Hellcat's 76mm gun would slice through the Panther's top armor like paper. He gave the fire command, and Corporal Washington sent the first round downrange. The armor-piercing shot hit the Panther's engine deck, and the tank ground to a halt, smoke pouring from its vents. Before the German crew could evacuate, the second Hellcat in Webb's platoon fired, hitting the same vehicle in the rear hull. The Panther erupted in flames. The other Hellcats opened fire in the coordinated sequence they'd practiced. The fourth vehicle in the German column, a Panzer IV, took a hit that penetrated its turret ring, causing the turret to jam. The last vehicle, one of the Jagdpanzers, was struck in the engine compartment and began burning. The German column was now trapped, unable to advance past the burning Panther or retreat past the destroyed Jagdpanzer. What followed was a masterclass in the tactical employment of tank destroyers. For the next 42 minutes, according to Webb's after-action report preserved in U.S. Army records, his platoon systematically engaged the trapped German vehicles. The Hellcats would fire from one position, then immediately displace to an alternate position before German return fire arrived. The Germans attempted to organize coordinated responses, but the combination of poor visibility, confusing terrain, and the Hellcats' mobility made it impossible to achieve effective fire control. German tank commanders couldn't maintain visual contact with the American vehicles long enough to coordinate responses. By the time a Panther identified a Hellcat's firing position and rotated its turret to engage, the American vehicle was already gone, reappearing seconds later from a completely different angle. The psychological effect was devastating. German crews were fighting an enemy they couldn't pin down, couldn't predict, and couldn't escape from. Oberst Gustav Hoffmann had commanded panzer units since the invasion of Poland in 1939, survived 3 winters on the Eastern Front, and earned the German Cross in Gold for his leadership during the retreat from Kursk. He'd faced Soviet armor in situations where tactical errors meant immediate death, developed instincts for armored combat that had kept him alive through 5 years of war, and trained countless young panzer officers in the brutal arithmetic of tank versus tank combat. The Americans' Hellcat forced him to question everything he thought he understood about armored warfare. His battalion had encountered Hellcats for the first time near Luneville on September 18, 1944. The engagement lasted 19 minutes and cost Hoffmann 7 Panthers, nearly half his effective strength, in exchange for 1 American vehicle disabled by a lucky shot that damaged its transmission. The after-action analysis revealed what should have been obvious. His Panthers were magnificent vehicles designed for the wrong war. Or rather, the Americans had invented a new kind of war where traditional panzer advantages became liabilities. The Eastern Front had taught Hoffmann that armor engagements were about 4 factors: gun penetration, armor protection, crew training, and numerical superiority. German tanks typically held advantages in the first 2 categories. Soviet forces in the 4th and the 3rd determined which side could exploit their advantages most effectively. This calculus had held true across thousands of engagements from Smolensk to Kharkov to Kursk. The Hellcat introduced a 5th factor that invalidated the traditional equation: speed as both offensive weapon and defensive protection. Hoffmann studied American tank destroyer doctrine through captured training manuals and debriefings of prisoners from Hellcat units, as documented in Wehrmacht intelligence reports from this period. The American approach rejected every fundamental principle of German panzer doctrine. Where German tanks advanced in formation, supporting each other with overlapping fields of fire, Hellcats operated in dispersed patterns where individual vehicles acted semi-independently. Where German doctrine emphasized holding ground and fighting from defensive positions, American tank destroyers treated every position as temporary, never remaining static long enough for enemy forces to coordinate effective responses. The most disturbing aspect was how American doctrine leveraged their vehicle's speed to achieve consistent first-shot advantages. In Hoffman's experience, armored engagements were typically decided by whoever spotted the enemy first and got off the first accurate shot. German optics and crew training traditionally provided advantages in target acquisition, but that mattered little when Hellcats were already in position, waiting in ambush, before German forces even entered the engagement area. Hoffman began implementing countermeasures based on his analysis. He reorganized his battalion to operate in smaller, more dispersed formations that were harder for Hellcats to ambush effectively. He emphasized aggressive reconnaissance, using infantry and lighter vehicles to scout routes before committing his precious Panthers. Most importantly, he trained his crews to prioritize speed of engagement over precision. Better to get rounds downrange quickly, even if they weren't perfectly aimed, than to take time for ideal firing solutions that would never arrive because the target had already vanished. The new tactics achieved some success. In an engagement near Château Salins on October 9, 1944, Hoffman's battalion encountered a platoon of Hellcats attempting to establish ambush positions. His lead element spotted the Americans moving into position, a rare occurrence, and immediately opened fire, forcing the Hellcats to break off their attack before they could achieve their preferred tactical setup. One Hellcat was destroyed, another damaged, and the remainder withdrew. It was the first time Hoffman's battalion had achieved better than even exchange rates against the American tank destroyers. December 1944 brought the coldest winter in decades to the Ardennes forest, and with it came Hitler's desperate gamble, the massive counteroffensive the Allies would call the Battle of the Bulge. For the Hellcat battalion scattered across the American lines, the German attack presented challenges unlike anything they'd encountered during the pursuit across France. The Americans were on the defensive, German forces had numerical superiority, and the frozen terrain limited the mobility advantages that made the Hellcat so deadly. The 634th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with M18 Hellcats, found itself rushed to the town of St. Vith on December 17, 1944, to help contain the German penetration. Captain James Thornton, the battalion's operations officer, watched from a hilltop observation post as elements of the 6th Panzer Army rolled west, the largest concentration of German armor he'd seen since Normandy. The numbers were daunting. Intelligence estimated over 200 German tanks in the assault waves heading toward American positions. The tactical situation was unprecedented for Hellcat operations. Instead of hunting German armor across the open countryside of France, the tank destroyers would fight a defensive battle from prepared positions. Instead of hit-and-run ambushes, they'd need to hold critical road junctions against overwhelming forces. The weather grounded Allied air support, eliminating one of the Americans' key advantages. Frozen ground made digging difficult, and heavy snowfall reduced visibility that the Hellcats' open turrets usually exploited. Thornton positioned his Hellcats to defend the critical road network converging on St. Vith. Each platoon received specific sectors to cover, with firing positions selected to maximize the M18's advantages in gun performance while minimizing exposure to German return fire. The plan called for trading space for time, allowed German forces to advance into prepared kill zones, inflict maximum casualties, then withdraw to secondary positions before German forces could concentrate enough combat power to overwhelm the thinly held American lines. The German attack hit Thornton's positions on December 18th at dawn. The assault waves included Panthers and Panzer IVs from elite Waffen-SS units, supported by infantry and assault guns. The Germans advanced with the methodical precision of veteran units executing a well-planned operation. But as they entered the approaches to St. Vith, they encountered the same nightmare that had haunted German panzer commanders since Normandy. Hellcats appearing from unexpected positions, firing with deadly accuracy, then vanishing before effective responses could be coordinated. Staff Sergeant Raymond Cooper commanded one of Thornton's Hellcats positioned at a crucial crossroads south of St. Vith. His position overlooked a valley that German forces would need to traverse to reach the town. Cooper's crew had arrived the previous night, dug in their Hellcat using the frozen ground to create a hull-down position that exposed only the turret, and prepared 2 alternate firing positions connected by routes they'd marked with white tape visible in the snow. The German column appeared at 0630, a company of Panthers advancing in formation with infantry support. Cooper let them close to 800 meters, well within the 76mm gun's effective range, before opening fire. His first shot struck the lead Panther in the glacis plate, the armor-piercing round punching through and detonating the ammunition storage. The tank exploded spectacularly, blocking the road and forcing the following vehicles to stop. Cooper's loader, Private First Class Antonio Rodriguez, had already slammed the next round into the breech. The second shot hit the Panther behind the leader, penetrating the turret and killing the crew. Before the Germans could locate Cooper's position, his driver had the Hellcat moving, racing along the pre-planned route to the second firing position, 200 meters away. The entire engagement, 2 shots, 2 kills, displacement to alternate position, took 38 seconds. This pattern repeated throughout the day. Hellcats would engage from prepared positions, inflict casualties, then withdraw before German forces could concentrate effective return fire. The M18's speed remained an advantage even in defensive operations. Where towed anti-tank guns and slower tank destroyers could be identified and destroyed once German forces pinpointed their positions, Hellcats could shoot and scoot, appearing at new locations before German artillery could adjust fire. Lieutenant Karl Schmidt had joined the 9th SS Panzer Division in November 1944, a replacement officer fresh from training school who'd never experienced combat. His battalion commander, a decorated veteran of 4 years fighting, gave Schmidt advice that seemed to contradict everything he'd learned in training. When you encounter American tank destroyers, your survival depends on understanding that every tactical principle you've learned is designed to get you killed. The Americans don't fight the way we taught you to fight. Adapt or die. Schmidt's first engagement with Hellcats came on January 7, 1945, during the German withdrawal from the Ardennes. His platoon of 4 Panthers was providing rearguard security for withdrawing infantry when they received reports of American armor advancing along their withdrawal route. Schmidt deployed his tanks in a textbook defensive position, overlapping fields of fire, good sight lines, protected flanks, exactly as prescribed in the training manuals. The Hellcats appeared from 3 different directions simultaneously, a coordinated ambush that turned Schmidt's carefully prepared position into a death trap. The first indication of enemy presence was an armor-piercing round that penetrated his wingman's Panther through the rear deck armor, striking the engine and setting the tank ablaze. Before Schmidt could issue fire commands, a second Panther was hit from a different angle. This one struck in the turret ring. The third Panther began rotating its turret toward one of the enemy positions, but the Hellcat had already moved, appearing seconds later from behind a farmhouse 400 meters to the left. Schmidt's own tank was the 4th Panther in the formation, and his driver reacted with the quick thinking that saved their lives. Without waiting for orders, the driver threw the transmission into reverse and backed the 45-ton Panther behind a stone barn at full speed. An armor-piercing round struck the ground where they'd been positioned a second earlier. The driver continued reversing, putting the barn between the Panther and the last known enemy position, then spun the tank around and accelerated away from the killing ground. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. 3 Panthers destroyed, 1 escaped, and Schmidt never got off a single shot. He never even got a clear look at the enemy vehicles that had devastated his platoon. In his after-action report, preserved in German military archives captured after the war, Schmidt wrote, "The American tank destroyers do not engage in combat. They execute. There is no battle, only killing." That description captured something essential about Hellcat tactics that traditional military terminology struggled to express. Conventional armored engagements involved mutual combat, both sides maneuvering, shooting, and attempting to achieve tactical advantage. Hellcat operations eliminated the mutual aspect. The Americans imposed their will through speed and positioning, creating situations where German forces couldn't meaningfully respond. It wasn't combat. It was systematic destruction. By early 1945, the Wehrmacht had developed more effective countermeasures against Hellcat tactics, as documented in captured German training bulletins from this period. The recommendations emphasized dispersed formations, aggressive reconnaissance, preemptive artillery fire on suspected ambush positions, and immediate withdrawal when contact was made, rather than attempting to fight. Essentially, German doctrine acknowledged that Panthers couldn't defeat Hellcats in direct engagement and recommended avoiding contact whenever possible. This represented a remarkable psychological shift for an army that had built its reputation on aggressive armored tactics. The Blitzkrieg doctrine that devastated Poland, France, and initially the Soviet Union emphasized concentrated armor attacking at points of enemy weakness, achieving breakthrough and exploitation. Now German forces were being taught to avoid combat with a specific enemy vehicle type, to treat contact with Hellcats as a reason to withdraw rather than engage. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. But the Hellcats' impact on armored warfare extended far beyond the destruction tallied in after-action reports. The M18 had validated a radical concept, that mobility and firepower could substitute for armor protection in specific tactical applications. According to official U.S. Army statistics compiled after the war, M18 Hellcat battalions achieved the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any American armored vehicle in the European theater, approximately 4-to-1 overall, with some battalions exceeding 8-to-1. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, one of the highest-scoring Hellcat units, was credited with destroying over 600 German armored vehicles during 11 months of combat operations from Normandy to Germany. The battalion lost 53 Hellcats during the same period, approximately 40 to enemy action, the remainder to mechanical failure or accidents. This represented a paradigm shift in armored combat, where survival came not from withstanding enemy fire, but from avoiding it entirely through superior mobility. The German perspective, documented in post-war interviews with surviving Panzer commanders, revealed the psychological impact of facing Hellcats. Oberst Hoffmann, who survived the war, described the experience in his memoir published in 1953. The M18 was not simply a weapon system. It represented a fundamentally different philosophy of armored warfare that our doctrine couldn't counter effectively. We were taught to win through superiority in armor, firepower, and crew training. The Americans demonstrated that speed and tactical flexibility could trump all three. The M18's open-topped turret, initially considered a vulnerability by conventional military thinking, proved to be an advantage in actual combat operations. The design saved 3 tons of weight that would have been consumed by a fully enclosed turret, allowing for higher speeds and better acceleration. The improved situational awareness from the open turret helped crews detect threats earlier and coordinate responses faster. In the terrain of Western Europe, where engagement ranges were typically under 800 meters, the thin armor became irrelevant. Any German tank gun that achieved a hit would penetrate regardless of armor thickness. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Army's Armored Board identified the key factors in the Hellcat's success, as detailed in their technical reports from 1946. First, the power-to-weight ratio that enabled exceptional mobility. Second, the hydraulic turret traverse that allowed rapid engagement of targets from any direction. Third, the 76mm gun that could defeat German armor at typical engagement ranges. Fourth, and perhaps most important, the tactical doctrine that leveraged these technical advantages into consistent operational success. The Hellcat's influence shaped post-war armored vehicle development worldwide. The concept of light, fast, powerfully armed vehicles optimized for specific tactical roles, rather than general-purpose employment, became standard in military planning. The French AMX-13, the Soviet ASU-85, and later the American M551 Sheridan, all reflected lessons learned from the M18's operational success. The emphasis on mobility as protection, the importance of power-to-weight ratios, and the value of specialized vehicles for specific tactical missions all traced back to the Hellcat's combat record. For the German tank crews who faced them in 1944 and 1945, the M18 Hellcat represented more than just an effective weapon system. It symbolized the moment when American industrial capacity and innovative thinking combined to create solutions that German military tradition couldn't counter. The 3 minutes that German crews had to engage Hellcats before they vanished at 55 miles per hour became emblematic of a larger truth. In modern warfare, speed and adaptability could defeat armor and firepower when employed with the right tactics. The last combat employment of M18 Hellcats in American service occurred during the Korean War, where several battalions were deployed in 1950 to counter North Korean armor. The mountainous terrain of Korea presented different challenges than the European theater. but the Hellcat's mobility again proved decisive. In the opening months of the war, M18 units achieved remarkable success against Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks, with the 773rd Tank Destroyer Battalion credited with destroying over 50 enemy tanks during the defense of the Pusan perimeter. Staff Sergeant Thomas Morrison, who had commanded a Hellcat in Europe and volunteered for service in Korea, found himself back in an M18 turret near the Naktong River in August 1950. The tactical situation was reversed from his European experience. Now American forces were defending against numerically superior armor attacks. But the fundamental principles remained unchanged. Morrison's crew would wait in prepared positions, allow North Korean T-34s to advance into killing zones, engage from the flank or rear, then displace before enemy forces could coordinate responses. The engagement patterns Morrison experienced in Korea validated lessons from Europe. Speed remained the Hellcat's primary protection. The ability to rapidly shift positions kept enemy forces off balance and prevented them from concentrating overwhelming firepower against individual vehicles. The 76mm gun, which had proven effective against German Panthers, easily defeated the T-34's armor at typical engagement ranges. The open turret, criticized by some military planners as obsolete, continued to provide tactical advantages in situational awareness and crew coordination. However, the Korean War also revealed the Hellcat's limitations in the evolving landscape of armored warfare. By 1950, the M18 was already obsolete compared to newer armored vehicles entering service. The arrival of Soviet-supplied heavy tanks later in the war, including the IS-2 and IS-3, presented challenges that the Hellcat's gun couldn't consistently overcome. The 76mm weapon that had been adequate against World War II German armor struggled against the heavier frontal protection of post-war Soviet designs. The last American M18 battalion was deactivated in 1953, shortly after the Korean War armistice. The tank destroyer concept itself fell out of favor in American military doctrine. Post-war analysis concluded that specialized tank destroyer units were redundant in an era when main battle tanks could perform anti-armor missions while also providing general-purpose combat capability. The M18 was replaced by vehicles like the M48 Patton, which combined armor protection, firepower, and mobility in a single platform, optimized for multiple tactical roles. Yet the Hellcat's influence persisted in unexpected ways. Several nations acquired surplus M18s after the war, with some remaining in service into the 1970s and even 80s. The Yugoslav People's Army operated Hellcats until 1972, valuing their mobility in mountainous terrain. The Chinese nationalist forces on Taiwan employed M18s into the 1965, seeing them as cost-effective solutions for coastal defense. Venezuela maintained a small fleet of Hellcats until 1975, using them primarily for training rather than combat operations. The veterans who had crewed Hellcats during World War II carried memories of a vehicle that represented something unique in military history. A weapon system so perfectly matched to its tactical doctrine that it achieved success far beyond what its specifications suggested possible. At reunions of tank destroyer battalions held throughout the late 20th century, former crew members shared stories that emphasized not the vehicle's technical features, but the confidence it inspired. The knowledge that you could outrun anything you couldn't outfight created a psychological advantage that was as important as the gun or engine. Technical historians studying the M18 identified specific innovations that influenced subsequent armored vehicle development. The use of lightweight, high-strength steel alloys in the hull construction anticipated materials science advances that became standard in post-war tank design. The hydraulic turret traverse system, adapted from naval applications, demonstrated the value of borrowing innovations from other military domains. The emphasis on automotive engineering principles in military vehicle design, Campbell's racing car background influencing the Hellcat's development, suggested that civilian expertise could solve military problems in ways that traditional military thinking might miss. The story of German tank crews having 3 minutes to engage Hellcats before they vanished at 55 miles per hour became part of armored warfare legend, cited in military academies worldwide as an example of how tactical innovation could overcome apparent disadvantages in armor and firepower. The M18 proved that warfare wasn't simply about building bigger guns and thicker armor. Sometimes victory came from being somewhere else when the enemy's shot arrived, from choosing engagements on your terms, from speed and cunning rather than brute force. In the quiet corners of military museums across America, restored M18 Hellcats sit as monuments to a brief moment when innovation, doctrine, and execution aligned perfectly. The vehicles look deceptively small compared to modern main battle tanks, their open turrets seemingly vulnerable, their thin armor apparently inadequate. But the veterans who crewed them knew differently. They understood that the Hellcat wasn't designed to absorb punishment. It was designed to never be where the punishment landed. In that specific tactical niche, for that particular moment in military history, it was as close to perfect as any weapon system ever achieved. The legacy lives on in the fundamental principles that guided Hellcat employment. Know your advantages, exploit enemy weaknesses, dictate the terms of engagement, and survive to fight again. These weren't just tactical guidelines for operating a specific vehicle. They were timeless principles of warfare that the M18 Hellcat demonstrated with deadly effectiveness across the battlefields of two wars. For the German tank crews who faced them, those 3 minutes before the Hellcat vanished at 55 miles per hour must have felt like eternity. And for many, it was the last eternity they would ever experience.